Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Now we will discuss about this topic, systematic literature review. It is one of the empirical methods in software engineering. It is one kind of secondary studies that I would like to explain in detail. Okay. So basically, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to firstly understand what secondary study is, and then able to understand and elaborate the steps involved in conducting systematic literature review. And thirdly, to formulate questions for systematic literature review. So first of all, you have to gain some understanding about what is a secondary study. Okay, and then from there, you will see, okay, what are the required steps needed in order to perform or conduct a secondary study. So one of the secondary study that we will focus for this topic is what we call as systematic literature review, or shortly known as SLR. And one of the important activity, okay, one of the important tasks, I would say, for SLR is that we need to formulate a question. Okay, so this is one of the things expected. At least by the end of this lecture, you can think about one interesting questions that you can put forward. Okay, if you are about to conduct a systematic review. So now, before I come to the secondary study, let me explain in general. There are several types of literature review. Okay, and the first one is traditional narrative review. So this is the most common technique, that people use in order to review study. So traditional narrative review is the way that you conduct a review without any systematic methodology. Okay, and then there is a method called systematic literature review, and systematic mapping study, and meta-analysis. So these four types of review are all review, and these are what we call as a secondary study. Why we call it a secondary study? It is a secondary study because these studies use existing studies or existing primary studies or existing empirical studies, as their content of study, right? So when we review, right, the basis of the review are the findings from existing studies. That's why we call it as a secondary study. And there is another kind of review that we call as tertiary study. So tertiary study is another level of review where we are actually looking at a set of secondary studies. Okay, so I will explain to you each of these briefly, so you get some basic understanding about each of these type of review. Okay, for the sake of this topic, at least you need to know in general how systematic review differ than the traditional review. Okay, so traditional review is the most common one being used, most common method being used to review studies, existing studies. It provides an overview of research findings about particular topics. You can see it's typical, this is a typical method that people use in order to review existing studies. Traditional means they perhaps just do some analysis, they just read some of the related papers of interest and then write a review or their opinion about something. So probably they will put some explanation about the topic, what studies have been conducted about that particular topic, okay, what are the interesting findings. So of course there are pros and cons, using this traditional review method. The benefit is that sometimes it can produce a very good, insightful, and good synthesis of the literature. However, it has to be conducted by the expert who are aware of the topic. Okay, um, the main issue, I would say, with traditional review, not really issue, but the contradiction, the is actually it is vulnerable to unintentional bias. Why it is vulnerable to such bias? Okay, because when we do review using this method, normally we are selecting the papers or selecting the studies just based on our interests. Okay, so there is a bias there, because sometimes we tend to select studies that of our interests. Okay, but there are of course some other studies maybe are relevant, but sometimes the authors purposely perhaps did not include those studies. So that will actually introduce some bias in terms of selection, interpretation, yeah, and organizations of the study findings. So it is good if an expert conducting this review study using this traditional review method, okay, because they are experienced in the topic. Okay, now how that traditional review, okay, differ than this systematic literature review. So systematic literature review is actually not a new methodology. Okay, this methodology has been there for a long time. It's been there in the field of medicine. Okay, and then it has also been used in other domains like in psychology, in education, in economics, and many other fields. So what is actually a systematic literature review? Okay, this is one of the definitions, and this definition is given by Kitchener and Charter. They say that systematic literature review is a form of secondary study that uses a well-defined methodology to identify, analyze, and interpret all available evidence related to specific research question in a way that is unbiased and to a degree repeatable. There are some keywords here. SR is a secondary study, and it uses a well-defined methodology. So in conducting the review, there is a proper methodology. A proper methodology for us to identify studies, to analyze those studies, and to interpret the study's findings. And then there is a specific question that we are addressing. Okay, so expectation is that it is unbiased, and because it uses a well-defined methodology, to a certain extent, the process is repeatable, sort of. Okay, so the expectation for SLR is that it aims to give a complete, comprehensive, and a valid picture of the existing evidence. Okay, the identification, analysis, interpretation must be conducted in scientifically and rigorous way. So there is a proper method, yeah, in conducting review as opposed to the traditional way in conducting review. And there is another kind of secondary study, what we call as a systematic mapping study. Systematic mapping study is actually a kind of SLR. It is a kind of systematic review that concentrates on locating and classifying literature, usually only provides aggregation against the various study categories. So here, mapping study is also a type of SLR. Okay, also a type of SLR. We will see the difference between SLR and mapping study. One is conducted mapping study actually to provide a wide overview about research area, while when someone that use SLR, they have a very focused topic. But if let's say you have some very broad area, for example, you wanted to review about existing testing techniques, that have been used, for testing mobile apps. So it's very wide. It's very wide. You're talking about all sort of testing techniques to test mobile apps, any kind of mobile apps. So it's a very I would say broad topic. And then when the intention is just to classify the literature. For example, we wanted to see what kind of software testings are available, which one has been frequently used. So it's more to like classifying the data, okay, where they have been published, who are the authors, okay. So that's why they call it a scoping study. All right, so it is not that much different than SLR. The process more or less the same as systematic literature review. And then there is what we call as meta-analysis. Still, I am still talking about all sort of techniques, for conducting secondary study. So meta-analysis is a quantitative analysis technique, that uses statistical procedure for combining data from multiple studies. So let's say we have conducted a number of studies, and the studies that we conducted, let's say, all are quantitative, and we have some data out of those studies. So actually we can aggregate, or we can combine the data from several quantitative studies, and then we can do meta-analysis. So meta-analysis, why we do this meta-analysis? Because when we wanted to make a decision, sometimes the results from one particular single study sometimes not sufficient, or not good enough, or not reliable enough, in helping us in making decision. So let's say, for example, we wanted to know whether a new method is good or not in improving software quality. If we were to rely on the findings from one empirical study, that may be not convincing enough. Okay, not convincing enough. I think the better word is convincing. So that's why we do meta-analysis. So we can see or explore if there is any heterogeneity, if there is any differences in their study findings. Okay, and the selection of studies for meta-analysis must be conducted in an unbiased manner. So if someone is doing SLR, okay, one of the possible method for them to analyze the data is by using meta-analysis. So meta-analysis is not possible to be conducted if someone is doing a traditional narrative review. Okay. And then we have what we call as tertiary study. So tertiary study is an SLR of SLRs. So we are doing a systematic review of a number of systematic reviews. So here the target is to actually answer a more wider questions. The method is the same as SLR. Okay, and it is potentially less resource intensive because our focus is just looking at the existing published systematic literature reviews. So this is just to summarize. Okay, if you look at this hierarchy of reviews, the empirical studies that we have seen last time, if you can recall, the survey study, the case studies, what else? The empirical studies that we have, any empirical studies or any study that have been conducted is what we call as a primary studies. Okay, any individual study. And then a secondary study is a review study. It's a review study to review existing primary studies. And tertiary study is actually a review study to review secondary studies. Okay, so you see what that is actually the scope of the review. So for tertiary study, we don't look at until this layer normally. Okay, and for secondary study, of course, our concern is on the existing related primary study, depending on the topic that we are investigating. Okay.